The main route between the towns of Dumfries and Annan in the south of Scotland is the A75. It's a well-lit modern road built in 1989. But back in 1962, the route to Annan from Dumfries consisted of unlit back roads, often single track. One such road would take you right past the Ruthwell Kirk in the manse of Ruthwell, and it's here where our bizarre tale begins. In April of the year 1962, two brothers, Derek and Norman Ferguson, were travelling by car back home to Annan and had stopped at a petrol station in Dumfries just before midnight. Annan was another 15 miles down the road, and as the brothers headed out from Dumfries, along the road lit only by the full moon with no other traffic anywhere in sight, they drove past Ruthwell Kirk, an ancient building, in fact the oldest in the southwest of Scotland. The kirk had at one time housed the Ruthwell Cross, a 7th century holy artefact, but the cross was condemned during the Reformation as being too papish, and it was broken up and the pieces hidden in the kirk graveyard. As the brothers Ferguson drove past the kirk, something suddenly flew directly at the car windshield. It looked like a large white bird, and Derek swerved to avoid a collision, but there was no impact, and the white something had completely vanished. That was just the start of their horror that night. After the white bird-like thing had vanished, a stream of sinister and unearthly figures appeared in the road. Huge cats, gigantic black dogs with eyes aglow, scavenger-type birds with long necks and sharp beaks, and some human or human-shaped figures all loomed up from the sides of the road and flung themselves directly into the path of the Ferguson car. Derek swerved to avoid these creatures, and even though it was obvious to him that they were not solid in form, he zigzagged along the dark road to avoid them. All of the forms seemed to dissipate just before the moment of impact, and Derek drove on terrified and deafened by the screams of his younger brother, 14-year-old Norman. The assault continued inside the car as the temperature dropped to freezing point, and Derek recounts that although the car became like an icebox, he was drenched in a cold sweat. Derek recalls the ordeal, saying that with ice forming around his mouth and nose, my hands were becoming heavy, as if some force was trying to get control of the steering wheel. It was becoming harder and harder to keep control of the motor. Me and Norman were suffocating, and I opened the window to try to breathe, but it was freezing cold outside, and I just hung onto the steering wheel as the screaming, high-pitched laughing and cackling noises seemed to mark our predicament. I was absolutely sure that an attempt was being made to force us off the road, and I was just as certain that a fatal accident was going to happen. Finally, Derek, his hands numb from the cold, his eyesight blurred with cold tears, was forced to give in and stop the car. Immediately upon stopping, the brothers were hit by some unexplainable force that shook the car violently from side to side. The terrified Ferguson boys opened the doors and jumped from the car, intent on running away from the terrifying ordeal along the moonlit road beside the Kirk graveyard. But on exiting the vehicle, it was as if they had stepped into a completely different world. All outside the car was tranquil and calm. The brothers looked around and, seeing nothing, slowly re-entered their vehicle. But no sooner had they entered the car than the unholy cackling began again, and the car started to rock violently from side to side. Dozens of ghostly fists pounded on the windows, although nothing seemed to be there. Derek decided his only option was to continue the drive home to Annan, slowly and carefully, all the time trying to ignore the hellish cacophony that surrounded the car. He inched painfully on as ghastly supernatural figures flew themselves into the car's path. Finally, the brothers gasped relief to see a pair of red vehicle lights in the road ahead, the tail lights of a truck. Derek put his foot in the accelerator to catch up with this welcome sign of humanity, but he had pushed too hard on the gas pedal, and as the car was about to careen into the back of the truck, the truck vanished. It was no truck driven by a human, but another of the phantoms that assail vehicles on this section of the road. Now that was the last of the apparitions, and the Ferguson boys reached Annan exhausted and terrified, but at least alive and physically unharmed. Derek remains to this day convinced that if he had driven off the road or stopped for any length of time, both he and his brother Norman would not have survived that night. Later, Derek was told that centuries ago, witchcraft had been commonplace in the area around the Kirk graveyard where they had experienced the supernatural assault. Others said that a phantom truck like the one he and his brother had encountered has occasionally been reported by others. But no one else has reported being attacked by supernatural forces on the road. Derek often wondered why he and his brother had been singled out for that attack. Now Norman, he has said no more in this incident, but apparently the next day he took a small piece of stone from his bedroom and returned it to Ruthwell Kirk graveyard, which a month earlier he had found close to a gravestone.